My brother's name lit up my phone on a Wednesday afternoon in late October. We hadn't spoken since the Canada Day long weekend. Maybe 4 months. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. James. His voice was flat, controlled. The way he sounded in boardrooms, not in family kitchens. I'm calling about Dad. He passed away last night. Cardiac event. The funeral will be held Saturday at Callaway & Sons in Barrie. I've already been in contact with his estate lawyer. The property goes to me under the updated will. The farm, the equipment, the savings, all of it. I thought you should know before you heard it from someone else. The line went quiet. I stood in my workshop behind the house. Wood shaving still on my boots, a half-finished chair frame propped against the wall. And I smiled. Not a cruel smile. Not even a surprised one. I smiled because my brother had just made the most expensive mistake of his life. I had driven Dad to his cardiologist appointment in Orillia that very morning. We'd stopped for breakfast at the Sunset Grill on the way back. He'd had the 2-egg special with brown toast, complained the coffee was too weak, talked about whether to replace the fence along the east field before the ground froze. That was 4 hours ago. Let me go back a little. My name is James Holbrook. I'm 63 years old. I've lived in Simcoe County my entire life. Same stretch of rural Ontario where I grew up. Same gravel roads, same neighbors I've known since I was learning to walk. I'm a carpenter by trade, custom furniture, mostly. I work out of the workshop behind the property my wife and I have owned for 30 years. Our kids grew up here. Our grandkids visit every summer. My father, Walter Holbrook, turned 86 in September. He built the family farm in Essa Township from nothing, the way men of his generation did with early mornings and a refusal to quit. He'd been running beef, cattle, and hay since the early 70s. By the time I was old enough to help, the farm had 140 acres, a solid equipment shed, and a reputation in the county for being one of the well-kept operations along that road. Dad had slowed down. Of course he had. He didn't run cattle anymore, hadn't for about 5 years, but he still walked the property every morning, still kept the fences in reasonable shape, still had opinions about everything from crop rotation to the federal carbon tax. He wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. My brother Geoffrey left Essa Township in 1995. Got into the business program at Western, moved to Toronto after graduation, then Vancouver, then back to Toronto. He worked in commercial real estate development. Made good money, wore good suits. Called Dad twice a year, Christmas and his birthday, and sent a check each time, like that settled accounts. Dad cashed the checks and never said much about it either way. He wasn't a man who kept score out loud. I visited Dad 4 times a week, sometimes more. I drove him to his medical appointments. I helped him with the property maintenance. In the summer, I cut his grass. In the winter, I cleared his driveway before he woke up. We watched hockey night in Canada together on Saturdays. He'd sit in the same recliner he'd had since 1988, the one with the armrest duct-taped on the left side, and I'd sit on the couch, and neither of us talked much during the game. We didn't need to. After the game, he'd tell me stories. About building the farm. About my mother, who had passed 12 years ago. About a winter in 1978 when a blizzard came through and they were snowed in for 9 days and had to hand-feed the cattle twice a day in knee-deep drifts. I'd heard every one of those stories at least 20 times. I never once looked at my phone while he was telling them. Geoffrey hadn't been to the farm in 2 years. Last time I saw him in person was at Dad's 84th birthday, and he'd left before the cake was cut, because he had an early flight. That was the context when the phone call came. I set down the sanding block I was holding and walked into the house. My wife looked up from the kitchen table, read something in my face, and put down her book. "Geoffrey just called," I said. "He told me Dad died last night." She stood up immediately. "What? He's not dead," I said. "I had breakfast with him this morning. But Geoffrey doesn't know that. And that means something very bad is happening." I called Callaway & Sons first. The woman who answered had a careful, professional voice. "I'm inquiring about arrangements for a Walter Holbrook. My brother mentioned a service this Saturday." A pause. The sound of a keyboard. I'm sorry, sir. I'm not showing anything scheduled under that name. We have no record of a Walter Holbrook. I thanked her and hung up. I called the Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre in Barrie. Asked about admissions overnight. Any record of a Walter Holbrook? Any cardiac event? No, sir. No patient by that name in our system for the last 72 hours. That cold feeling started somewhere in my chest. Not grief. Something harder than grief. I called Dad's mobile. Rang 4 times. Then voicemail. That wasn't unusual. He kept his phone on the kitchen table most of the time and only remembered it was there when it rang loud enough. I called the house line. Rang 6 times. No answer. That was unusual. I told my wife where I was going, grabbed my jacket, and drove. The farm is 40 minutes from my house on a good day. Less if you push it. I pushed it. I went through Cookstown, cut up through the county road, turned onto the gravel lane that I'd driven down more times than I could count. The old silver maple at the gate was already bare. The lane was puddled from rain 2 nights ago. Dad's truck was in the yard. The side door to the house, the one we always used, through the mudroom was closed but unlocked. I knocked, waited, knocked again, then turned the handle and walked in. The kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke. The radio was on low. A country station. The old kind. Dad? I heard him before I saw him, the shuffle of his slippers on the hardwood. The slow, deliberate step of a man who'd learned to be careful on uneven ground. He came around the corner from the hallway in his barn coat and wool socks, reading glasses around his neck on a string my mother had made for him 30 years ago. He looked at me with mild confusion. James, something wrong? You were just here this morning. The relief was physical. I felt it in my legs. Inside, I said. I need to talk to you. We sat at the kitchen table. He poured coffee without asking, the way he always did. Set a mug in front of me and sat across with his own, and I told him what Geoffrey had said. His face changed slowly as I talked. He didn't interrupt. He had a particular stillness about him. When something mattered, he'd always been that way. When I finished, he wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the table for a long moment. Last month, he said. Finally, Geoffrey called. Asked me to walk him through the will. Wanted to know the exact breakdown. What did you tell him? The truth. I split it even. 50-50, you and him. The farm, the equipment, whatever's left in savings after expenses. I told him it was already drawn up and signed, and that I wasn't changing it. He paused. He didn't like that. What did he say? Said I was being sentimental. Said you'd probably just sell the farm anyway. So why not let him handle it since he actually understood property values? Dad's jaw tightened slightly. I told him the conversation was over. He hung up. I haven't heard from him since. Until today, I said. Until today. Dad stood up slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the east field stretched out brown and flat under the gray October sky. The fence line running straight along the edge where the property met the neighboring lot. He'd built that fence with his own hands in 1979. If he told you I was dead, Dad said, and there's no funeral home, no hospital, he's setting something up. Something that requires me to already be gone. I asked if he'd been in contact with his estate lawyer recently. He turned around. No. But I should be. His lawyer was a woman named Diane McTavish. She had an office in Barrie, had handled Dad's legal matters for the past 15 years. I called her directly and got her on the line within 20 minutes. She'd known our family long enough that she didn't waste time. If Geoffrey is representing your father as deceased to access the estate, she said, that's fraud. If there's any attempt to file probate on a living person's estate, it'll get flagged, but not necessarily immediately. The more pressing concern is whether Geoffrey is planning something beyond paperwork. I told her about the timing, the funeral that didn't exist, the hospital that had no record, the phone call that had been designed to establish a story. He needed you to hear about your father's death from a source, she said slowly. That's not fraud preparation. That's witness preparation. The room went cold. I watched Dad's face from across the kitchen. Diane put us in touch with a contact she trusted, a retired RCMP officer named Glenn Sutherland, who now worked in private investigation and elder protection cases. He drove up from Barrie that evening, sat at Dad's kitchen table, and listened to everything without writing a single note until I finished talking. Then he wrote for about 3 minutes straight. "Here's what concerns me," Glenn said, setting down his pen. "Geoffrey lives in Toronto. He doesn't have daily access to your father, which means if he's planning to do something, he either needs to come here in person or he's already done something remotely." He looked at Dad. "Have you had any visitors in the last week or two that seemed unusual? Anything delivered? Anything you ate or drank that came from someone other than James?" Dad thought for a moment. "Geoffrey sent a package about 10 days ago. Vitamins," he said. "Elderberry supplements, something for my joints." I took a few. Glenn didn't change his expression, but he took the name of the supplements, asked where the bottles were. Dad retrieved them from the bathroom cabinet, 2 bottles, one nearly empty. Glenn photographed them, noted the lot numbers, bagged both in Ziploc bags he'd brought with him. "We'll have these tested," he said. "In the meantime, Walter, I'd strongly recommend you stop taking anything that came from Geoffrey." Dad nodded once, like he'd been told to check the oil in his truck. Steady as a fence post in summer. I asked Glenn what he recommended. 2 things, he said. "First, Walter shouldn't be alone here. If Geoffrey is coming and based on the call, I think he's expecting to find this house empty or find your father in a compromised state. We want Walter somewhere safe, somewhere Geoffrey can't walk in." He looked at me. "Your place? He doesn't have my address. I moved 6 years ago, and Geoffrey never asked." "Good. Second, we need to let this play out. Geoffrey called to establish the story. He'll likely make contact again to move on whatever the next step is. When he does, we want to be recording." Glenn set up a recording application on my phone before he left that night. Walked me through it twice. We moved Dad to our place after dinner. He packed slowly, the way he always moved through his house, not rushing, touching things, picking up a framed photo of my mother from the mantel and wrapping it in a flannel shirt before putting it in the bag. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before I turned off the light. 46 years in this house," he said. "Not to me, really. Just saying it." "You'll be back Monday," I told him. He looked at me, and something in his face said he understood it might not be that simple. But he nodded, and we went. Dad slept in our guest room. My wife made him oatmeal in the morning. He watched the news and read the weekend paper and asked if I had any projects in the workshop he could look at, which was his way of needing to feel useful. I showed him the chair frame I'd been working on. He examined the joinery for longer than necessary and told me the mortise on the back left leg was slightly off. He wasn't wrong. 3 days passed quietly. Diane monitored any activity connected to the estate with the lawyer's registry. Nothing moved. Glenn had the supplements tested through a private lab he used in Mississauga. We waited. On the 3rd morning, my phone rang. "Geoffrey." I looked at my father across the kitchen table. He nodded without a word. I answered, "James." Geoffrey's voice was different from the first call. Softer, almost gentle. "I've been thinking about you. I know this week has been terrible. I should have called sooner to check in. How are you holding up?" "It's been hard," I said carefully. "Of course it has. Look, before the estate process begins, I thought we should meet. There are some things I'd like to discuss in person. About Dad's wishes, about the farm, about what makes sense going forward." A pause. "I'm going to be up in Barrie this weekend. Would you be willing to meet me at the farm Saturday morning? 9 o'clock? I said I would. He said he appreciated it. He sounded genuinely warm. After I hung up, Glenn was already leaning forward from his chair in our living room, where he'd been sitting out of sight during the call. "He thinks the house is empty," Glenn said. "Or that your father is incapacitated. Either way, he's not expecting complications." He contacted the Ontario Provincial Police that afternoon. 2 officers were assigned plain clothes, 2 vehicles. Glenn coordinated the positioning with them. My wife's sister came to stay with Dad at our house. I wore a wire for the first time in my 63 years of life. A small device taped between my shoulder blades that the OPP officer checked twice and told me not to think about. If he says something useful, let him say it, the officer told me. Don't push. Don't summarize for him. Just listen. Saturday morning was cold and clear. One of those late October days in Ontario where the sky is completely blue and the frost stays on the grass until noon. I drove up the county road, turned onto the gravel lane, and saw Geoffrey's rental car already parked in the yard. Black BMW. Ontario plates from a Pearson airport agency. He was standing at the side door, dressed in a dark coat, leather gloves, looking at the barn the way someone looks at something they're already calculating the price of. He turned when he heard my truck, smiled. James, thanks for coming. We shook hands. His grip was different from what I remembered, firmer, deliberate, the kind of handshake that's making a point. Inside, the house was cool. I hadn't turned the heat up more than necessary since we'd moved Dad out. Geoffrey walked through the kitchen slowly, opened the fridge, closed it, ran a hand along the edge of the old kitchen table. Strange being here without him, he said. I didn't answer. Look, he said, settling into Dad's chair at the head of the table, something he'd never once done when Dad was home. I'll be straight with you. The estate process is going to take time, and I want to make sure we handle it properly. I've been working with an estate consultant in Toronto, someone who specializes in agricultural properties. He thinks the farm could list at somewhere between $850 and $920, depending on the season. That's a significant asset. Dad's will splits it evenly, I said. Geoffrey's expression shifted slightly. Dad's will. Yes. The original will. But Dad and I had a conversation in September you may not have known about this, where he told me he'd been reconsidering the split. Given that I have more experience with property transactions, he wanted me to oversee the estate sale rather than both of us trying to navigate it. He told you he was changing the will? He indicated he was open to adjusting the arrangement. Diane McTavish doesn't have any record of an amendment being filed. Something crossed Geoffrey's face. Gone in an instant, but I saw it. Estate matters move slowly. I'm sure she will. I looked at him across the table. Our father's table. The one with the burn ring near the middle from a pot set down without a trivet in 1994. The one where I'd eaten probably 10,000 meals, and done my homework, and watched my mother pay bills, and listened to my father talk about the farm in every season of my life. Geoffrey, I said. Dad isn't dead. The silence was very complete. I had breakfast with him Saturday morning. I continued. Same as every Saturday. He had oatmeal. He mentioned the east fence. And then you called, 4 hours later, to tell me he died overnight. Geoffrey's expression was still. Not shocked, controlled. He was calculating. The hospital had no record. I said. The funeral home had no record. And you called to make sure I heard it from you first. James, the supplements you mailed him have been tested. I watched his face. The lab in Mississauga found elevated levels of digoxin in the elderberry bottle. Not enough to be acutely lethal in a single dose. Enough to accumulate. Enough to cause cardiac arrhythmia over 2 to 3 weeks in a man with an existing heart condition. Something broke through the controlled surface. Not remorse. Something colder. He forgot to take them half the time, I said. You probably know that. I'm guessing you counted on a more consistent schedule. Geoffrey looked at the kitchen table, then back at me. When he spoke, his voice had changed entirely. The boardroom warmth was gone. What was left was something I didn't quite recognize as the older brother I'd grown up with. Do you know what that farm is worth? He said. Do you have any idea? $900,000, James. Probably more once the market cycles back. And it was just sitting here. Going nowhere. He was never going to sell it. He would have run it into the ground for sentiment and left us both with a tax liability and a maintenance headache. His voice had an edge now. Something that had been waiting behind the professional polish for a long time. I've spent 30 years building something. I understand asset management. I understand what to do with capital. And instead, he was going to split it down the middle with the carpenter who never left town. He was going to split it with his son, I said. You don't think the same way I do. You would have kept the farmhouse because it has sentimental value and let the fields go to seed. You'd have turned it into a museum. Maybe, I said. It's my inheritance to waste if I want. The will should reflect contribution. Geoffrey said. I contributed. My money helped him keep this property through 2009 when beef prices collapsed. I sent him $10,000 that year. Did he tell you that? He told me. Then you know. He told me he paid it back. I said. 2 years later, he showed me the bank transfer. He didn't want to owe you. Geoffrey stopped. Outside, I heard gravel shift under tires, the sound of a car door. Then another. Geoffrey's head turned toward the window. I want you to understand something, I said. Dad is alive. He's healthy. The OPP have been listening to this conversation since you said the word digoxin. And Glenn Sutherland, who handled the supplement testing, is standing outside that door right now. The side door opened. The OPP officer I'd met 2 days earlier stepped in, badge visible, one hand resting at his side. A second officer came through the front. Geoffrey stood up from the chair. Our father's chair. Geoffrey Allen Holbrook. The officer's voice was level and unhurried. You're being detained for questioning in relation to suspected elder abuse, criminal fraud, and administering a noxious substance. You don't have to say anything, but anything you do say may be used in evidence. Geoffrey looked at me. For a moment. Just a moment. He looked the way he had when we were boys before the business degree and the BMW and the 30 years of believing that ambition was the same thing as worth. You would do this to me, he said. You tried to kill our father, I said. They took him out through the side door. I stood alone in the kitchen for a while, listening to the gravel crunch under the tires as the cruiser pulled out of the yard. The radio on the counter was still on low, a fiddle tune I didn't recognize. I called Dad. It's done, I said. A pause on the other end. I heard my wife's voice in the background, then quiet. How is the house? Dad asked. Cold, I said. I'll turn the heat up. Check the oil tank while you're at it. I meant to do it last week. I checked the oil tank. It was fine. The OPP investigation ran through the winter. The supplement testing confirmed the digoxin contamination enough, the forensic analyst said, to cause a fatal cardiac event in a man of my father's age and condition, given consistent daily intake over 3 to 4 weeks. Geoffrey's lawyer argued that he'd purchased the supplements without knowledge of the contamination, that it was a product liability issue, not criminal intent. The recorded conversation in the kitchen made that argument difficult to maintain. The fraud charges came from the attempt to misrepresent the estate. Geoffrey had contacted a property assessor in Toronto and an estate liquidation firm, both of whom confirmed they'd been told Walter Holbrook had recently passed and that the estate was entering probate. He'd done it before the phone call to me. He had, as Diane McTavish put it, front-loaded the lie. Geoffrey pleaded not guilty. The trial was set for the follow-up. In the meantime, Dad came home. I drove him up the county road on a Monday morning in November, the maple branches bare, the fields gray and still. He got out of the truck slowly, stood in the yard, looked at the barn, the house, the fence line along the east field. He didn't say anything for a moment. Furnace running? He asked. I checked it Friday, I said. We went inside. I turned the kettle on. He walked through the rooms the way he had when we'd left that first night, touching things, looking, taking stock. He stopped at the mantel and straightened the framed photo of my mother that he'd packed and I'd returned to its spot. We had coffee at the kitchen table. Diane called me, he said, about the Slayer provision. She says Geoffrey would lose his share regardless of how the trial concludes, given the evidence. What do you want to do with it? He was quiet for a while. The furnace kicked on. Outside, a crow landed on the fence post along the lane and sat there, glossy and unbothered. The farm stays a farm, he said. Whatever happens to me, I don't want it sold off and turned into subdivisions. If you want it, it's yours. All of it. But you have to keep it as what it is. I don't know anything about farming. He looked at me over his coffee mug. You knew nothing about furniture making once either. I didn't have an answer for that. There are people in this county who'd lease the fields, he said. Young families who want to farm but can't afford land. You could do it that way. Keep the property, lease the acreage. Let someone actually work it. He paused. Your mother always wanted that. Someone young on this land. Someone with kids. I told him I'd think about it. He told me not to think too long. That Saturday, we watched the hockey game. He sat in the recliner with the duct-taped armrest. I sat on the couch. Neither of us talked much during the game. During the second intermission, he told me about the winter of 1978, the 9-day blizzard, the cattle in the drifts, how he and my mother had done it together, twice a day, every day, and how she'd never once complained. I'd heard it so many times I could have told it myself, could have gotten every detail right. The name of the bull they lost on day 6, the temperature the thermometer read on the worst morning, the sound the barn door made when the wind caught it just right. I listened to every word. The trial came in September. Geoffrey was convicted on the criminal fraud charges and the charge of administering a noxious substance with intent to endanger life. He was acquitted on the more serious attempted murder charge. The Crown couldn't establish sufficient proof of specific intent beyond the recording, which the defense successfully argued was ambiguous on the question of premeditation. Geoffrey's lawyer was thorough and expensive and earned his fee. Geoffrey received 4 years, eligible for parole consideration after 2, with a permanent prohibition from acting as executor or beneficiary of any estate in Ontario. He served the sentence at a medium security facility in Penetanguishene. I visited once, in the first year. We sat across a table in a gray room, and I mostly looked at my hands. The farm, he said. What did you do with it? Leased the fields to a family from Innisfil, I said. Young couple, 2 kids. They're running market garden. Vegetables, some heritage grains. They're at the Barrie Farmers Market every Saturday. He was quiet. Dad likes them, I said. Goes over to say hello sometimes. The kids call him Mr. Holbrook and he pretends to find it ridiculous. Geoffrey looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, I thought I deserved it. I know, I said. I thought the way I'd lived my life, the things I'd built, I thought that entitled me. It didn't. No, he said. It didn't. I didn't visit again. That felt like enough. I inherited the farm the following spring, when Dad officially signed everything over and moved into the smaller house he'd built for my mother's parents on the south end of the property back in 1991. It had good light and a wood stove and a covered porch that faced west. And he sat there in the evenings watching the sky change over the fields. I kept the house exactly as it was. The kitchen table with the burn ring, the recliner with the duct tape, the photograph of my mother on the mantel. On Saturday nights through the winter, I drove down the county road and we watched hockey night in Canada together. He sat in his chair. I sat on the couch. The games mattered less than the intermissions, and the intermissions mattered less than the stories, and the stories were about everything that had happened on this land before I was born and would still be here long after we both were gone. I never got tired of them, because I learned something through all of this that I already knew but had never had to say out loud. Legacy isn't money. It isn't property values or estate splits or what a farm can list for on a good market. It isn't what you accumulated or how far you traveled or whether anyone ever put your name in a business magazine. Legacy is what you do with the ordinary time. The Saturday games and the Tuesday breakfasts and the 3-minute phone calls about whether the oil tank needs filling. The fence you help repair in September, even though it'll need doing again in 3 years. The stories you've heard so many times you could recite them in your sleep, but you listen to anyway because the person telling them is still here, still breathing, still sitting in the same chair with the same duct-taped armrest. And that fact alone, that plain, unremarkable, everyday fact, is the only inheritance that ever really mattered. My brother chose a different measure. He had 30 years to revise it, and he didn't. I think about him sometimes when I drive past the Innisfil family working Dad's old fields. Their oldest kid waves from the fence line if she sees my truck. She's 8 years old, and she knows my name, and she knows my father's name, and she knows the farm has been here since before her parents were born. That's what we were protecting. That's what was almost taken away. And on Saturday nights, The hockey game ends, and my father tells me about the winter of 1978, and I listen like it's the first time.